Three chilling accounts carry us from the trails of Redwood National Park, where a hunter stumbles on a skull unlike any other, to the mist-drenched falls of Sequoia, where a lone camper comes face to face with a towering shadow beneath the trees. And finally, high in Yosemite's Granite Domain, an unsuspecting traveler records a series of bone-rattling screams that defy earthly explanation. Each story is a puzzle piece in a larger mystery, a reminder that even in our most revered landscapes, the line between the known and the unknown can vanish beneath the twilight. Welcome to Weird Encounters, a place where the ordinary fades into shadow and the unexplainable comes alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and become part of our ever-growing community of the curious. Now prepare yourself, because what you are about to hear is not for the faint of heart. I'm not the easiest person to rattle, but I have to get this off my chest because I've been turning it over and over in my head for the last few weeks. You can call me Lou, though that's not my real name. I'm from Crescent City, and I practically grew up roaming the Redwood National Park region. My dad taught me how to track deer there when I was barely big enough to hold a rifle. I usually hunt for black-tailed deer or the occasional feral pig around the northern part of the park, in that border area close to where the Klamath River meets the ocean. Beautiful country. My father used to tell me stories of the local Yurok tribe and their beliefs about forest spirits. As a kid, I thought those were just colorful legends. But after what I found, let's just say I'm now more open to the idea that there might be forces in those trees that don't belong in the everyday world. A few months ago, late autumn around the third week of October, I was hunting alone near an old logging road that locals refer to simply as the Broken Spur. It's not on most maps anymore, but if you're from the area, you know where it is. Weather was changing that day, thick fog rolling in off the coast, the kind that clings to your jacket and makes you wonder if you're not alone. I remember checking my phone. 5:47 p.m. But it felt way later because the sun was dropping behind the tall stands of evergreens. That's when I found the remains. At first, I noticed what looked like several large bones scattered along a hidden ravine, maybe 15 feet below that old path. Now I'm not squeamish. I've dressed out deer. I've even cleared out the occasional predator from farmland in my youth, so bones don't usually make me nervous. But these bones, there was something different about them. The skull in particular, bigger than a human, but shaped strangely. I've seen bear skulls, mountain lion skulls, elk, deer, you name it. And I can tell you, from the slope of the forehead to the eye socket shape, it wasn't any of those. It almost resembled a gorilla's skull, but not quite. We don't have gorillas wandering Redwood National Park, so I don't know what the heck I was looking at. Let me pause here to say I nearly talked myself out of going down to inspect it more closely. It's not the easiest or safest thing, sliding down to a narrow ravine with a loaded rifle slung over your shoulder. But my curiosity got the better of me. The air down there was stifling, even in the open. I recall how my entire body felt colder as I approached the remains. Now maybe it was just my nerves, but it seemed as though a quiet fell over the forest. The only sound was my pulse hammering in my ears. Looking closer, the skull was bigger than a man's head by a good margin. I'd guess at least a quarter or half bigger in volume. The jawline was wide, the teeth looked a bit more like ours than a bear's or a cat's, and the eye sockets, they seemed forward-facing, not on the sides. My first wild thought was, this might be that mythical Bigfoot everyone around here whispers about. But that's not something you just say out loud to yourself. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Then I realized that under the decaying leaves and half buried in the dirt, there appeared to be more scattered remains. Ribs, vertebrae, something that might have been a broken femur. There were signs that something had rummaged through them. Possibly scavengers, coyotes, or maybe a black bear. But the weird part was the arrangement. Some bones looked intentionally piled as though someone had been messing with them or collecting them. I was so fixated on trying to figure out the shape that I didn't notice how the wind had picked up. By the time I did, I also realized it was going to get dark in a hurry. And I started feeling this intense pressure, that sensation you get in a place you're not supposed to be in. Reminded me of the time as a teenager when I stumbled onto an abandoned campsite people said belonged to some weird cult. There was just that intangible heaviness in the air. I decided to take a few pictures, but my phone was almost dead and refused to capture anything clearly in the dim light. The flash made everything look washed out, and my hands were shaking so bad I doubt I could have gotten a steady shot anyway. This is the part that might sound unbelievable. About 10 yards away from that skull, I saw an old set of footprints in the soft ground, bigger than any shoe size I've encountered, and definitely bigger than mine. I wear a size 12. The prints looked old, but they were still visible enough to notice 5 distinct toes, so if these belonged to a person, they'd have to be extremely tall and broad. If they belonged to a bear, well, it sure didn't match a typical bear track. The stride between footprints was a bit too wide as well. As I was about to make my way back up, I recall hearing a muffled snapping sound in the brush. You know that feeling when your stomach sinks and you get hyper-aware of every little movement? My peripheral vision was telling me I wasn't alone. I could sense something or someone at the top of the ridge, though I couldn't see them. I didn't exactly want to wait around and find out what it was. I practically clawed my way back up, got to the path, and listened. The snapping turned into rustling, and then quiet. In that moment, every childhood ghost story about Redwood National Park came roaring back into my mind. A handful of days later, I told a buddy from Oric about what I saw. He's a local fisherman with a knack for tall tales, so I wasn't sure if he'd believe me. But in indirect words, he said he'd heard talk from a park ranger a few months earlier of unclassified remains being found deep off trail. That ranger apparently got transferred pretty quickly, which stirred up rumors. Some folks started speculating about logging company cover-ups, others whispered about government involvement. My friend said, in his own way, that Redwood National Park has always been thick with the unexplained. I'd intended to go back, but I couldn't find the exact spot on subsequent trips. The forest can be like that, shifting, changing, especially in the heavier rainfall months. One day, you swear you know a route by heart, and the next, it's like the trail vanished or the landscape rearranged itself. I even asked around with a few folks I trust, another friend who hunts, a retired ranger living near Klamath. Some of them mentioned hearing distant howls at night. Others talked about seeing huge, shadowy shapes moving between the redwoods at dusk. And one older fellow confided in me that he'd seen something he described as a walking bear 5 years ago, an hour's drive southeast of Crescent City. If you press them for more details, they tend to clam up, but the undertone is always the same. We're messing in territory that might not belong to us. I haven't told many people about what I discovered, partly out of fear that folks will call me crazy, and partly because I don't want to be the one who leads a stampede of thrill seekers out there. But if you happen to be trekking through Redwood National Park, keep your eyes and ears open. The official line is that we have black bears, elk, mountain lions, but they don't talk about anything else. Even so, I have this unshakable feeling there's something out in those woods. And if you come across it, or if it comes across you, well, let's just say you might get more than you bargained for. Stay safe and be careful. Sometimes the forest hides secrets it would rather keep buried. Picture yourself venturing beneath the towering sequoias of California, lulled by the rush of a waterfall that sparkles in the moonlight. A camper, armed with little more than a tent, a sense of adventure, and an appetite for solitude, soon finds that something else stirs in those woods. And once you've heard their story, you might think twice before pitching your tent too far from the trail. I've been debating all morning about sending this in, but if I don't get it out there, I'm never going to sleep again. My name's Keith. Coincidental, I know, and I'm a pretty avid camper. I've spent years exploring different parts of California, always drawn to the rugged beauty of our national parks. Sequoia National Park in particular has a special place in my heart, so when I got a chance to head up there in early June, I jumped on it. I arrived on a Saturday afternoon at the Lodgepole Campground, snagged one of the last available sites, and immediately set off for a short hike toward Tocopah Falls. Some folks say it's among the most scenic waterfalls in that corner of the park. The path was still damp from late spring snowmelt, and the air was crisp, scented with pine and that unique wet earth smell you only get in mountainous areas. The plan was to do a little day hike, then come back to camp before dark and maybe roast a couple of hot dogs or something. Just me, the stars, and the comforting roar of the nearby Marble Fork of the Kaweah River. I ended up staying a bit too late at the falls, mostly because I lost track of time trying to photograph the rainbows forming in the mist. By the time I started heading back, the sun was sinking behind those colossal sequoias. The forest feels different at dusk, especially among those giant trees, like you've stepped into an ancient cathedral with no one else around. Except I realized I wasn't alone when I heard a very distinct crack of a branch not far off trail. I remember stopping short and thinking maybe it was just a bear. But the next noise sounded more like something heavy exhaling, almost a low grunt or moan. And I quickly thought, that's not a bear I'm used to hearing. I tried to ignore it, picking up my pace. When I reached my campsite, everything looked normal at first. My tent was undisturbed, my small cooler still latched, but a sense of unease clung to me. There was this thick, tense quiet in the area, as if everything else in the woods had decided to stop making a sound. I figured I was just spooked from that weird noise, so I tried to calm down, lit a small fire, and heated up some dinner. Later that night, had to be around 10:30 or 11, I was lying in my tent, listening to the constant rush of water in the distance. At some point, I dozed off. Out of nowhere, I was awakened by what I can only describe as deep, guttural breathing right outside the tent. Not a snort like a deer or the huff of a bear. It sounded more purposeful, like something that wanted me to know it was there. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it might burst. I dared not even unzip the tent because the fear that washed over me was paralyzing. I could see, through the thin fabric, a tall shadow cast by my dying fire. The silhouette looked massive, towering. I must have laid there for minutes, but it felt like forever. I kept expecting this thing to move along, but it just stood there, occasionally shifting its weight. Then I noticed the faint smell, something foul, like wet fur and decaying vegetation. If you've ever been to a farm with old, stale hay, it was a bit like that, but more pungent. My mind started racing. I'd heard stories of Bigfoot sightings in these parts, but always dismissed them as nonsense or tall tales for tourists. And yet here I was, lying inches from something that definitely wasn't your average black bear. I remembered hearing about local rumors. Some folks in the nearby town of Three Rivers talk about strange sightings near the Kaweah River corridor, especially in years with heavier rainfall. I guess they figure the thick underbrush and plentiful water might draw in all sorts of wildlife. But I also recalled reading an old story in a visitor center pamphlet that mentioned a large, bipedal creature spotted decades ago around this same area. The ranger on duty brushed it off as a local legend, focusing instead on safety tips for bears and rattlesnakes. Eventually, I heard this creature shuffle around the campsite, knocking something over, possibly my little camp chair or the fire ring grate. Then there was a peculiar, quiet grunt again, and suddenly the sound of heavy footsteps moving toward the undergrowth. I stayed frozen, trying to will my heart to slow down. I don't know exactly how long I waited, but after a while, I found the nerve to peer outside. My small fire had gone down to embers, the moonlight illuminating the trees just enough to see vague shapes. Nothing. Silence except for the waterfall in the distance. I barely slept that night, so come morning, I stepped out of the tent to look around. The camp chair was definitely flipped, and the back of it had a strange smear, kind of like a muddy handprint, only bigger than my own. My pack was still in place, but the side pocket was open, like it had been rummaged through. The ground was too rocky for clear footprints, but there were some deep impressions near a damp patch of soil behind my tent. Each impression looked somewhat elongated, not like a typical bear paw. I had to gather myself because seeing that made all the fear from the night before come rushing back. I packed up fast. On my way out, I passed another camper, an older man in a green flannel who'd been up since daybreak. Indirectly, he mentioned hearing strange cries during the night, figuring it might be a wildcat or coyote. I just nodded, not sure I wanted to talk about the possibility that we had something else creeping through the campground. And the weird part is, after I got back home, I learned from a coworker who grew up near Visalia that there have been covered-up sightings of a massive bipedal figure around that general region for years. People are scared to say much because they don't want the park to become overrun with thrill seekers or ridiculed by skeptics. I'm telling this story because I want folks to know I genuinely believe there's something out there. Whatever I heard and saw that night was beyond anything I'd experienced in all my years of camping, almost like it was sizing me up or studying the campsite. If anyone else out there has had a similar encounter in Sequoia National Park, I'd really like to know I'm not alone. The granite giants of Yosemite, their ancient faces towering above the valley floor, a place where millions come seeking nature's majesty and a rare moment of tranquility. But what if, instead, an unsuspecting camper found themselves capturing something so unearthly and disturbing that it would forever change how they saw those peaceful forests? Welcome to a story of unsettling echoes in the Californian wild. I'm a Los Angeles native, born and raised in Eagle Rock, though I've always considered Yosemite National Park my second home. I've taken more trips up there than I can count, mostly weekend getaways to places like Camp 4 or Upper Pines, sometimes venturing deeper into the backcountry when I'm feeling adventurous. I've heard plenty of the usual sounds one might expect out in the wilderness: bears rustling through undergrowth, the wind howling at Glacier Point, coyotes calling out under a pale moon. But in all my years, I've never heard anything like what I recorded just a few weeks ago. I was up near the Mist Trail, not too far from Vernal Fall, making my way toward the top late in the afternoon. I have this weird habit of starting hikes in the late day because I love to watch the sunset across the valley. This time, I got delayed by a bit of a jam near the steps. Some folks taking pictures, a couple of kids who slipped on the wet rock. By the time I reached the top, the light had changed to that golden hue that makes everything look surreal. I figured I'd pitch my small one-person tent somewhere close, not in an official campsite per se, but a quiet spot that I scouted on a previous trip. It wasn't exactly legal, so I won't be too specific. Let's just say it was off the beaten path enough that I had good cover among some boulders. That night, I was making dinner, a simple freeze-dried meal, when I thought I heard something echoing off the canyon walls, distant but sharp enough to catch my attention. It sounded almost like a high-pitched wail, but it ended in this guttural, throaty finish that made me freeze in place. My first instinct was maybe it was a mountain lion, but I've heard mountain lion screams before, terrifying enough in their own right, and this was different. It echoed in a way that sent chills running up my spine. I tried to brush it off as just an odd sound or maybe a weird bird call. About an hour later, it started again, only closer. I scrambled for my phone, figuring I might as well record it in case it was some unusual wildlife or something I could identify later. While I was fumbling to open my recording app, I realized that the forest had gone dead silent around me. No night insects, no rustling in the nearby bushes, nothing. That alone put me on edge. Finally, I managed to hit record just as another scream pierced the night. Listening through my headphones after the fact, I could still feel that same wave of dread. The pitch rose and then dropped like it was coming from some massive chest cavity. I can only compare it to a wolf or a coyote that's been given an amplifier, but that still doesn't quite describe the weird layered tone it had. I was shaken enough to abandon the idea of a peaceful night's sleep out there. I didn't exactly want to risk an encounter with whatever was making those noises. Maybe I should have packed up and hiked down, but that trail is treacherous in the dark, especially near the falls. So instead, I hunkered down, hoping that my tent and a good measure of caution would keep me safe until morning. I spent hours lying awake, hearing that same call, sometimes further away, sometimes echoing like it was right across the canyon. I never spotted anything, not even with my flashlight, though I was half afraid I'd see eyes reflecting back at me if I looked hard enough. Come daybreak, I practically flew down the trail, not bothering to eat breakfast. Along the way, I bumped into a couple from the Bay Area who looked startled as I passed by. In their own words, they mentioned hearing loud screeches echoing from somewhere above them in the night, and they had no idea what it was. We all had that wide-eyed look of shared confusion, and maybe fear. This made me realize I wasn't just imagining things. There truly was something screaming in those woods. Once I got back to my car near Curry Village, I tried to calm my nerves. I stopped at the village store for a cup of coffee, browsed around just to settle down. Not surprisingly, if you casually mention hearing strange calls in Yosemite, you mostly get chuckles or folks telling you it was probably a raccoon or a fisher cat. But I let a friend of mine, a fellow from Oakhurst who's been a seasonal worker, listen to my recording. His eyes went wide, and he said that he'd heard rumors from the rangers about unnatural-sounding screams near the backcountry, but they never acknowledged them publicly. Some folks blame it on cougars, others whisper about cryptid creatures or leftover legends of the Ahwanichi people who once inhabited the valley. I'm not jumping to claim it's Bigfoot or a skinwalker or anything specific. I'm just saying, if you heard the audio I captured, you'd have second thoughts about what roams the shadows of Yosemite. I tried searching online, but the best I got were theories about wendigos or unidentified forest creatures. And as skeptical as I usually am, that night made me wonder just how many corners of these national parks remain unexplored, and how many mysteries remain unsolved. Now, I still love Yosemite, but every time I remember those screams echoing off the canyon walls, I get a tight feeling in my chest. I've shared the audio with a few close friends, but I'm hesitant to post it publicly because I know the wave of skepticism and ridicule that might follow. If there's anyone else out there who's heard similar sounds or encountered something bizarre in the park, I'd be curious to know. Because I can't help but think there's more out there than just the usual wildlife, and I was unlucky, or maybe lucky, enough to catch a glimpse of it in the form of those unearthly screams. Be careful if you're camping in remote spots near the falls or anywhere off-trail. We like to think we're alone out there, but this experience taught me we might have company of a kind we're not ready to understand. And so, amid the granite domes and cascading waters of Yosemite, a camper from LA found more than just peace and quiet in the moonlit forest. Terrifying, echoing screams that defy simple explanation, echoes of something primal, or simply the cries of nature misunderstood. Sometimes our beloved parks hide secrets as old as the mountains themselves. What is it about those shadowy forests of Washington state that sets the mind on edge? One moment, it's all serene trails and ancient evergreens. The next, the whisper of wind might not be wind at all. Over the years, there have been plenty of rumors, glimpses of towering shapes, echoes of an impossible howl carried on the nighttime breeze. But for others, these stories are more than just rumors. They're jarring, vivid encounters on the threshold of the unknown. 4 stories with the inexplicable, each threaded by a simple question: what truly roams these shadowy domains? Together, let's find out. The wooded hollows of Mount Rainier National Park whisper old stories, tales of silent watchers, strange footprints left behind in the snow, and restless nights near flickering campfires. Few places in Washington carry as much grandeur and perhaps as many hidden truths as those towering slopes. And sometimes, in these rugged forests, it's not just the wildlife that stirs at dusk. I'm a park ranger at Mount Rainier National Park. I've been here for years, long enough that I can pinpoint the exact spots where black bears like to forage, and the times of day when the mountain goats are most active near sunrise. Never in my time patrolling have I felt truly afraid of anything in these woods, but that changed about a month ago, right after the crowd started thinning out in late September. I was on a routine evening patrol, not far from the Paradise area. Sometimes we get hikers who overstay their welcome or decide to camp in restricted zones. The night was getting that crisp chill, the kind that creeps in fast once the sun drops behind Rainier. I was about to head back when the dispatch informed me there was a call from some distressed campers over by the Cougar Rock campground. They said a woman showed up at their campsite frantic, saying she'd encountered something big and hairy. She was convinced it was stalking her and her fiancé. The exact wording as relayed to me was that it growled like it was half man, half beast. Honestly, my first thought was, probably a bear. We get them rummaging around sometimes, especially if campers haven't stored their food properly. I reached the campsite around 9 p.m., which is later than I prefer to be out there alone, but that's part of the job. The couple looked spooked, and the woman was shaking, wrapped in one of those emergency blankets. She wouldn't look me in the eye, kept glancing over her shoulder, like she expected something to come barreling out of the tree line at any second. The fiancé relayed how they'd heard snapping branches behind their tent, bigger than what any raccoon or smaller animal could manage, and when they shone their flashlight, they saw a tall shape, taller than a person, broader. Definitely not a deer. The fiancé said it was like an ape, but with longer arms and a strange, almost human posture. As they were packing up to get out of there, the woman said she caught a glimpse of it between 2 massive Douglas firs. She swore it had a face that looked part human, intelligent eyes but overshadowed by a brow ridge. Now, I've heard plenty of Bigfoot tales around here. I'm not blind to the local folklore. There have been random footprints found in the Nisqually area, odd howls at night near Mowich Lake. Usually, it's chalked up to rumor or someone's overactive imagination, but these campers seemed genuinely terrified, not the typical folks just spinning a yarn for attention. I tried to calm them down, saying we'd do a sweep of the area and then escort them to safety. A colleague arrived shortly after, another ranger who's been on duty for about 4 years. Together, we combed the perimeter with our flashlights. The trees loomed large, and the only sounds were the wind high in the canopy and our boots crunching pine needles underfoot. We didn't see anything at first, but we did find the remains of a shredded sleeping bag. It looked like it was yanked violently, threads scattered around, as if something huge had grabbed and torn it to pieces. The fiancé claimed it was his bag that he left outside to air out. It was covered in a dark, muddy substance, perhaps just dirt, or maybe something else. The woman got more agitated by the minute, insisting we leave right away. I told her we couldn't go just yet because we needed to make sure the area was clear, especially if there was an aggressive animal around. That's when we heard what I can only describe as a low, throaty grunt off in the distance, real deep, resonating through the trees. It wasn't a bear's growl. I've been around plenty of those. This was different. My partner froze, aimed his flashlight in the direction of the sound, and for a brief moment, we both saw a pair of eyes shine, like a dull red reflection, way too high off the ground to be a normal creature. Then it vanished. We radioed in that there might be a large animal in the vicinity, possibly a threat to campers. Dispatch gave us the usual spiel: stay cautious, keep us updated, and so on. The woman was by this point crying softly, clinging to her fiancé, telling him they should never have come here. That's when she said something that struck me as bizarre. She claimed it had followed them from a different campsite earlier in the day near Ohanapakash, and they thought they'd shaken it off by driving up to Cougar Rock, but apparently it was persistent. I felt a twinge of paranoia then, thinking about how these sightings or experiences might be more common than we admit. I remembered a few months ago, one of the older rangers told me off the record that she was convinced something lived in the remotest parts of the park, deeper than the standard backcountry trails. She'd found footprints once, bigger than any human could make, each print so deep in the soil that it implied unimaginable weight. At the time, I just listened politely. Now, I found myself believing her words a bit more. We escorted the campers out around 10:30 p.m., driving them down to the ranger station at Longmire. The roads were dark, winding, and each flicker of movement in the forest had me on edge. My colleague kept scanning the tree line as we drove. We didn't talk about the eyeshine or the sound, but I could tell he was troubled. Back at the station, the couple gave a brief statement, basically repeating what they'd told me. One detail stood out. The woman insisted at one point she locked eyes with the creature and felt a sort of primal fear, a sense that it wasn't just an animal. She said it felt too aware, too calculating. She believed it was not just territory protective, but actually terrorizing them, as if it wanted them gone. Over the next couple of days, other rangers quietly mentioned they'd had calls or sightings that seemed to match the description. Tall, bipedal, hairy. One ranger, who usually manages the Carbon River area, said he found large footprints near Ipsut Creek. Another swore up and down they heard muttering sounds, guttural, but almost like speech. I know it sounds wild. It still does to me. But it's not the first time I've heard these odd stories float around. The higher-ups tend to keep this stuff quiet. Officially, we're told to treat it like potential wildlife, or, at worst, trespassers in furry costumes. But there's a part of me that wonders if there's more going on. Like it might be a known phenomenon that no one in a position of authority wants to confirm. I've even overheard talk about some government folks poking around, but I won't get into that. Just know it's crossing my mind. I haven't seen or heard anything since that night, but I've been on high alert. Every distant branch snap puts me on edge now. I've spoken to the woman and her fiancé only once more. They called the station for a follow-up. She said she was still having nightmares, that she wakes up thinking she hears that grunt outside her window. Part of me feels sorry for them. They came here expecting a peaceful getaway beneath Rainier's majesty, only to leave with a story they can't make sense of. I don't know what else to say. Maybe if more people share what they've seen, we can piece together the truth. They say it's just a legend, an old tale folks in these parts spin around a campfire to liven up the stillness of the Washington wilderness. But the forest doesn't always heed the boundaries of belief. Sometimes, in the loneliness of a hunting cabin deep in the pines, there's a sound that's too terrifying to dismiss, too real to ignore, and it echoes long after dawn breaks. I hope you don't think I'm losing my mind. I'm sending this because I need someone to hear what happened to me near Colville National Forest, about a 30-mile drive northeast of Kettle Falls, Washington. My buddies and I have a rustic hunting cabin out there. We go every year around late October to hunt elk or deer, depending on the season. It's nothing fancy, just 4 walls and a tin roof in a clearing surrounded by dense pines. Usually, it's peaceful. This time, it was anything but. I arrived a few days before the others since I wanted to get an early start on scouting. The first 2 nights were quiet, just the wind rattling the trees and the occasional coyote yips in the distance. Then, on the third evening, right around dusk, I started hearing these weird low-pitched howls or screams. Not the high coyote type, and definitely not a wolf's howl. More like a deep, vibrating moan that sent chills down my spine. I tried to shrug it off, thinking maybe it was some injured animal or a weird echo, but something in my gut told me it wasn't normal. The next morning, I ventured a couple miles away from the cabin with my rifle, hoping to catch a buck moving at daybreak. I didn't see any deer, no birds, no nothing, which was odd. I noticed how still everything was, like even the squirrels were hiding. I decided to head back early. When I was maybe half a mile from the cabin, I heard branches snapping behind me, heavy footsteps, like a large animal. But then it stopped. Every time I paused, the sound ceased. Every time I moved again, I caught it behind me, a step or two off in the brush. It felt like something was tracking me. I can't even describe how unsettling that is, to sense eyes on you in a place you usually feel at home. I ran the last stretch to the cabin, slammed the door shut, and checked if my radio had any signal. Barely any. I had told my friends to meet me there in the afternoon, so I tried to calm myself down, convincing myself it might just be a bear. But that evening, once the sun started going down, I heard that same deep moaning scream, only this time it was much closer. It sounded like it was coming from just beyond the tree line, somewhere out in the darkness. My heart was pounding so hard I swear I could feel it in my throat. I shut off every light inside, thinking maybe it would go away if it didn't see any activity. That's when something slammed against the side of the cabin, like a massive fist hitting the wood. I nearly dropped my flashlight. I heard scratching, heavy breathing, almost like a snort. I raised my rifle, but my hands were shaking so badly I wasn't sure I could even aim straight. Another slam, this one on the back wall. I'd never felt so vulnerable. It was like I was in a cage, and something outside was trying to get in. It went on for what felt like hours, these low, guttural sounds circling around. Sometimes I'd hear a step or two on the porch, the wood creaking under heavy weight. At one point, I could have sworn I saw a shape pass by the window, very tall, broad shoulders, and a head that seemed too high for a regular person. I stayed absolutely still, crouched in a corner, clutching my rifle, trying not to make any noise. Eventually, the sound stopped. I remember how the silence felt even worse, because I didn't know if it was gone or just waiting out there. Later, I heard the sound of voices calling my name. My friends had arrived sometime in the early morning. I stumbled out, telling them something was out here. They looked at the marks on the cabin, scratches and weird smudges at about 7 feet off the ground, too high for any normal animal we know out here. One of them said they'd heard odd hollers echoing in the trees when they came in, but they just thought it was wind, or maybe a distant cougar call. When I described it, they looked uneasy, because it didn't sound like any cougar or bear they'd ever encountered either. We scouted the area around the cabin in daylight and found several huge footprints in the soft dirt by the creek. They were shaped like a human foot, but twice the length, with deep impressions like whatever made them weighed a ton. Some part of me thought, Bigfoot. But I didn't want to say it out loud. It's the kind of thing people laugh about until they experience it themselves. We even found a partially broken branch up high, like 7 or 8 feet off the ground, snapped clean at a point that seemed impossible to reach without a ladder or being really tall. I wanted to leave that day, but my friends convinced me to stay a bit longer, saying if we left right away, we'd never understand what happened. The second night, we all crowded inside the cabin with the lights off, guns ready, just listening. We heard distant moans, but not as close as before. It was like it was letting us know it was still around, though not prepared to make a move with multiple people there. That was the last night we stayed. We left early the next morning, all of us feeling that weird sense of dread, like we had no business being out there anymore. I'm not the kind of person who believes every rumor about monsters in the woods, but I can't deny what I experienced. The way it moved, the way it screamed, and the sheer size of the thing that left those prints. No normal animal does that. My friends are still pretty rattled, and a few said they'll never go back to the cabin again. I'm not sure how to even start this because I'm still kind of shaken up. I live on a bunch of land with my family outside of Spokane, Washington. It's mostly forest and fields, and we've got a creek that runs along the back edge of our property. We hunt deer every year to help stock up on meat, and my dad's been teaching me how to track animals since I was like 10. I love being out there in the early morning, especially when the fog clings to everything like we're in some old movie. But now, I'm honestly scared to go back alone. I woke up super early, like 4:30 in the morning, because I wanted to see if I could catch a buck that's been roaming around. It was freezing cold, with that weird damp air you get in late October. I grabbed my gear, snuck out quietly, and headed toward the tree stand we built near the creek. It's not a big production or anything, just some boards and old camo netting. Usually, I settle in there, wait, and watch the deer come through around sunrise. That morning, I didn't even make it to the tree stand. As soon as I got near the clearing, I noticed all the birds were dead silent. Normally, you hear at least some crows or maybe a hawk overhead. It was just way too quiet. I felt this kind of heavy feeling, like the air itself was thicker. I kept going, but my heart was pounding for no real reason I could pinpoint. Then, I heard something moving in the brush, like branches snapping under real weight, not just a squirrel scurrying around. I thought maybe it was a bear, so I slowed down, trying not to spook it. I peered over this little ridge, and I saw a dark shape standing upright next to the creek. It was huge, like way taller than my dad, who's over 6 feet. It was bent forward, and I could see these massive shoulders. My brain wouldn't even let me think Bigfoot at first. I just thought, that's got to be a big man in a weird coat or something. But who the heck would be out there in the pre-dawn freezing cold, not wearing any bright hunting gear? I looked through my rifle scope just to see clearer. My hands were shaking so bad, I had to kneel down to steady myself. And I swear, I saw hair, not clothing. Dark, kind of brownish hair that was matted in places. The thing lifted its head, and I noticed it had this, I don't know, kind of a cone-shaped skull. Its face was partially in shadow, but I could see it had a flatter nose than any human. And the eyes, this is the part I can't stop thinking about, they seemed to reflect a bit of the early dawn light, almost like a deer's eyes do at night. They looked aware, like it recognized I was there. I actually felt something like panic shoot through me. I didn't even consider pulling the trigger. I just crouched there, hoping it wouldn't notice me. But then it made this deep grunt, nothing like a bear or a moose. My chest felt tight, and for a split second, I actually worried I'd pass out from fear. The creature leaned down near the creek, scooped up some water in its huge hand, and drank. I know how crazy this sounds, but that's exactly what it looked like it was doing. Suddenly, it whipped its head in my direction, and I swear it locked eyes with me. I couldn't breathe. For a moment, time felt totally slowed down. Then it backed up into the thick brush, moved so quietly for something that big. I heard branches snap, but it was still so quick. Everything in my body was telling me to run, but I kept thinking if I bolt, it might chase me. So I stayed frozen for a good minute or two, just listening. And then nothing. Just the wind in the trees and my own heart pounding in my ears. When I finally got the courage to move, I practically crawled back toward the house. I kept stopping every few yards, scanning the tree line, convinced that massive shape would reappear. I didn't tell my dad right away because I was afraid he'd say I was imagining things, or that it was probably just a bear. But when I did mention seeing something weird, he just looked at me like he kind of believed it. He said there have always been stories around these parts of big, hairy creatures, but most folks just roll their eyes. I asked him if that's what people mean when they say Bigfoot. He shrugged and changed the subject. I think he didn't want to scare me more. Anyway, I haven't gone hunting since. If anyone else around Spokane or anywhere in Washington has seen something like this, maybe they'll feel less crazy hearing my story. There's a peaceful silence that settles over the colossal evergreens of Mount Rainier National Park at twilight. It's a place known for scenic vistas and tranquil trails, and for secrets that lurk on the edges of the human mind. And for one park ranger who simply wanted to do his job, the ordinary was about to become extraordinarily unsettling. I've been with the National Park Service for over a decade, stationed at Mount Rainier National Park for the past 7 years or so. I've never had a problem. Actually, I've loved every minute of it, from the steep climbs to the changeable weather to those quiet moments in the backcountry when you can almost feel the mountain breathing. But things took a weird turn sometime in late October last year, right before the first big snow-blanketed paradise, and the roads started closing at night. I was patrolling near the Nisqually entrance around dusk. That's usually when we do some routine checks. You see, once the heavier snows come in, that entire section can become treacherous. The day had been straightforward. Some hikers left behind a messy campsite near Cougar Rock, and a family swore they heard odd howls, though I chalked that up to typical wildlife or even wind through the canyons. Mount Rainier can play tricks on folks who aren't used to how sound travels in dense forests. But that evening, as I was making my last pass, I noticed shadows moving strangely among the tall firs. It was off-trail, probably 100 yards from the roadway. I initially dismissed it as my headlights dancing off the trunks, but the movement was too coordinated, like a form slipping behind each tree just as the light landed there. I remember thinking, maybe it's a group of trespassers messing around. Sometimes we get folks who don't abide by park rules, but they usually avoid rangers like the plague. Here's where it got really odd. Right about then, my radio crackled with a faint voice, but the message was garbled, not the typical static or partial words. It almost sounded like that voice over internet protocol distortion, or like someone whispering in a broken signal. I went to respond, but the radio went dead. No beep, no static, nothing. It's not unusual for signals to drop in mountainous terrain, but this felt different. I tried not to let it rattle me. I pulled off into a clearing to get out on foot. The air was that crisp cold you only feel on Rainier's slopes when the temperature is about to plummet. I started scanning the tree line with my flashlight. At first, all I saw were my breath clouds forming in the beam, but then I caught sight of footprints in a patch of damp, partly frozen earth. Huge footprints. I've come across bear tracks and cougar prints more times than I can count, but they were shaped oddly like a person's, just impossibly large and set far apart, as if something very tall walked through the area with incredible stride. The caretaker side of my brain said, maybe they're from some large person wearing heavy boots, but I knelt down and realized there were toes, not the impression of a boot tread. Toes. I've heard the rumors about Bigfoot sightings in the Mount Rainier region. If you spend enough time at ranger stations, you'll overhear talk or read a typed-up incident report about unusual footprints or glimpses of tall, hairy shapes at the edge of the tree line. Usually, no one takes them too seriously, but this was in front of me, right there in the half-frozen mud. I swear it made my hair stand on end. I started to rationalize. Maybe it's a hoax or some elaborate prank. I mean, the park gets its fair share of enthusiasts. We once had a group up at sunrise who insisted they saw a UFO near Emmons Glacier. One even claimed to have footage, though the phone battery died. The next day they were gone, leaving just scuff marks in the visitor center parking lot. People come from all over with all sorts of stories. As I was examining the tracks, something moved in my peripheral vision. Tall, broad-shouldered, and definitely not any bear I've encountered. I didn't get a direct look. It was more like a silhouette cutting through the gray haze behind the trees. My gut reaction was to call out, but I held my breath. The figure paused, and for a moment, I was sure I was the one being watched, not the other way around. All of a sudden, I heard a distant cracking sound, like a branch snapping under tremendous weight. By the time I swung my flashlight in that direction, it was gone. The forest was dead silent. I stood there for what felt like an eternity. I've never felt that level of tension before, and I've come across more than a few close calls with wildlife. This felt completely different, primal in a way. Maybe 5 minutes later, I was able to get my radio working again. The weird thing is, a colleague asked if I'd heard anything about unauthorized vehicles in the area. He said he saw headlights flickering around but lost sight of them almost as quickly as he spotted them. I told him to meet me near Christine Falls to compare notes. Driving to Christine Falls, I was going slowly, scanning the roadside with a spotlight. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was paralleling me, keeping just out of sight, just beyond that ring of light. I remember recalling an old story a retired ranger told me about hearing knocks on trees back in the 80s, apparently a phenomenon associated with Bigfoot encounters in the Pacific Northwest. At the time, I wrote it off as folklore, but I found myself on that dark road, half wishing I'd paid more attention to the details. When I reached Christine Falls, my colleague looked unsettled. He wouldn't confirm or deny anything. All I got was that he'd seen movement in the trees, possibly multiple shapes. He told me I might want to keep quiet about the footprints, especially if I valued not being pestered by media types, or worse, certain government folks who sometimes appear after these incidents. We both decided to continue the shift as normal, but something definitely changed in the atmosphere that evening. Later that week, a small group of researchers showed up out of nowhere, apparently with special permits. Now it's not unusual to have geologists or volcanologists in the park because Rainier is an active stratovolcano. But these folks were evasive about their purpose. All I gathered was that they were conducting wildlife surveys. One of them I overheard in passing mentioned large bipedal tracks. I couldn't make out the rest, but it confirmed that I wasn't the only one who had seen something. In the following days, I had the persistent feeling I was being watched. Every time I'd get out of the truck to check an area, I'd sense a presence just beyond my field of view. If you've ever been out in deep wilderness alone, you know that feeling. Like the forest itself is alive and tracking your every move. I tried not to sound paranoid. Actually, I never mentioned it on the official log or daily report. Half of me feared being labeled as a crackpot. The other half feared something else entirely. That there's a truth out here bigger than me. Bigger than anything we normally put in official reports. One evening, after the park closed for winter operations, I drove down to Longmire to grab supplies. On my way, I passed a black SUV with tinted windows parked near an old service road. Not a common sight. I pulled over, thinking maybe they needed help. Before I got too close, the driver's window rolled up, and the SUV sped off into the night. There was no plate visible. It was either missing or purposely blocked. It rattled me more than the big footprints, to be honest. I'm not sure if there's a government connection or if it's just random suspicious behavior. Still, it felt linked somehow. Sometimes you hear talk about quiet check-ins and interest in cryptid sightings. A friend of mine swore they once had a conversation with an older military officer who hinted that certain areas around Mount Rainier are known for unexplained phenomena, and that's the official stance. Something is out there on Rainier's slopes, something that steps beyond the boundary of what we know or can comfortably explain. I may never see it clearly. It might stay a shape in the tree line, but I'm sure it's there. I'm still on active duty with the Park Service, and I can't risk my job. But folks deserve to know that these quiet forests might just hold more secrets than we realize. Two haunting accounts from opposite ends of the country, yet bound by the same bone-chilling thread. One, born in the misty shadows of Washington's towering evergreens, the other taking shape in the brooding depths of Pennsylvania's ancient woodland. Each teller thought they knew the forest, that they'd heard every snap and growl that the wild could offer, until they came face to face with the unimaginable. Let's follow these two nightmarish trails into the unknown. I finally decided I can't keep this bottled up. I'm originally from Spokane, Washington, so I've been camping and hiking around the Pacific Northwest my whole life. I thought I knew these forests. I thought I'd seen every type of wildlife you could imagine, like grizzlies in Glacier National Park and cougars prowling the outskirts of Coeur d'Alene. I even heard the distant call of wolves out near Okanogan. But I'm telling you, I have never experienced anything like what happened to me just last month in Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forest. I was up there around mid-October, technically off-season for most casual campers, but I like the quieter spots in the fall. The weather had been weirdly warm during the day but dropped to near freezing at night. I set up a small campsite near Baker Lake, thinking I'd do a bit of trout fishing the next morning. I'd arrived late in the afternoon, so by the time the tent was pitched, the sun was already dipping behind the pines. It was a Tuesday, October 18th to be exact, and there were hardly any other campers or hikers around. The ranger I bumped into on the way said something about a possible storm rolling in. Now, I want to mention something seemingly trivial, but it still unnerves me when I think about it. On my drive up to the trailhead, I passed an old man standing by his beat-up Ford truck on the side of the forest road. He was wearing this ratty flannel jacket, looked like he'd been out there for a while, and he waved me down. He never directly asked for help, he just sort of stared, and I couldn't make sense of his expression. He tilted his head like he was trying to hear a distant sound. When I rolled down my window to see if he was okay, he gestured vaguely up the road as if something was waiting for me. Then he just tapped the side of my car, walked off into the underbrush, and disappeared. I brushed it off as maybe he was just a local who liked messing with out-of-towners. But now I wonder if he was trying to warn me. That night, around 1 a.m., I woke up to the sound of heavy footsteps circling my tent. Not just scurrying like a raccoon or a deer, these were solid thuds, like a large man trudging around. I tried to convince myself it was just an elk or a black bear, but the cadence was wrong. It kept circling, then pausing for way too long, then circling again. At one point, there was this low humming or growling noise, almost mechanical, but mixed with a guttural animal sound. I must have laid there, paralyzed with fear, for a good hour. Around 2:30 a.m., I actually unzipped the tent flap a couple of inches to peek outside. I caught a glimpse of something tall and gaunt, maybe 7 feet, but I couldn't see it clearly. It moved in a flash of pale gray skin, no fur that I could discern. My flashlight was shaking so badly that the beam flickered all over the place, so I didn't get a good look. But I know it was standing on 2 legs, hunched, with elongated limbs. I don't know if you'd call it a crawler or something else entirely, but it was definitely nothing I'd seen in any field guide. When it noticed my flashlight, it let out this short, sharp exhale like air escaping from a broken pipe and darted into the tree line. Everything went dead silent. No crickets, no wind, no rustling leaves. I was too terrified to step out and check for tracks. I just zipped the tent closed and tried to keep from screaming. The next morning, I almost convinced myself it was just a vivid nightmare. But then I noticed a weird, chemical-like smell around my campsite. It reminded me of ozone after lightning strikes, or maybe burnt electronics. My fishing line, which I'd left coiled by a rock, was scattered in a spiral pattern, like something had deliberately picked it up and laid it back down in circles. It was surreal. I still thought about packing up and leaving right then, but I'd promised myself at least 2 days of camping. The day was calm, no sign of that thing, so I forced myself to stay. Toward evening, I ran into a pair of hikers, brother and sister from Bellingham, who were on a day trip. They said they'd seen something strange along the trail. The sister told me she'd noticed footprints that looked human but were far too large and spaced in an odd stride. The brother said he spotted a pale figure darting behind a tree, only to vanish when he tried to get closer. They were unnerved enough that they cut their hike short and were heading home. I decided to keep this to myself, but inside, my gut was clenched in terror. That second night was worse. The storm the ranger warned about had rolled in, unleashing torrential rain. Lightning flashed, illuminating the forest in these horrible bursts of white light. Each time it flickered, I thought I saw that thing standing a little nearer. At one point, I was almost certain that thing was perched on a branch, peering down like some twisted gargoyle. My phone battery had drained unexpectedly earlier in the evening. It was at 80% when I'd checked at dinner. So, I couldn't call for help or even take a picture. It kept dropping to zero no matter what I did. It was almost like an electrical anomaly was happening around me. Eventually, I grabbed my emergency flashlight and started sprinting down the trail in a blind panic. My plan was just to get back to my car, drive to the nearest motel, and figure out if I'd lost my mind. About a mile into the trek, I heard that hum behind me, accompanied by fleeting glances of that lanky figure weaving among the trees. There were points I thought I saw it in multiple places at once, or maybe it just moved impossibly fast. I tripped at least twice, slamming my knees onto gravel and pine needles. The last time I fell, I braced myself for the worst. I was sure this thing was right behind me. That's when I saw two faint beams of light flashlights from a search party, or maybe a group of rangers. They started calling out, asking if anyone was there. Their voices were muffled by the rain. As soon as those lights hit me, I felt a heavy tension lift, and the presence behind me seemed to vanish. They helped me hobble the last quarter mile to the parking area. One of them mentioned they'd been alerted by a pair of day hikers, the brother and sister, who reported seeing a distressed camper who might be in trouble. I was breathing so hard I could barely choke out a "thank you." When I tried to explain what I'd seen, they just nodded politely, like they'd heard every bizarre story under the sun. And that was the strangest part. One of the rangers said they'd had multiple calls about odd sightings in the forest. This past month, pale figures, strange vocalizations, missing time episodes. They didn't confirm or deny anything. They simply looked at each other with these grim expressions and walked me to my car. I wish I could tell you that's the end of the story. But ever since I came home, I've been plagued by nightmares. Sometimes I see that gaunt shape looming outside my bedroom window when I close my eyes. And my nephew swears he heard some weird, static-laced breathing over the line when I tried to call him about a week after the incident. What do you even call something like that? A Wendigo, a skinwalker, a crawler, an interdimensional being? All I know is I've never been so frightened, and I'm not the only one. When I tried looking up local news reports, I found odd references to campers going missing or complaining of strange hums at night. One hiker's note on a trail website mentioned something that looks like a deer but moves like a human, though I didn't find details beyond that vague mention. I can't make any sense of it, and the rescue team wouldn't elaborate. The local ranger station gave me a prepared statement about how wildlife can exhibit unusual behaviors under environmental stress. But this was no bear, no wolf, no normal creature. Maybe there's someone out there who's seen the same thing and can confirm I'm not losing my mind. So what are we to make of this nighttime stalker of the Pacific Northwest? A tall tale spun from the shadows of towering pines, or a genuine brush with something beyond our understanding? Perhaps we'll never know. The next account you're about to hear is not for the faint of heart. This email arrived with all the dread and desperation of someone who truly believed they'd seen something beyond the bounds of normal. Something that defies explanation. So settle in, because what follows is a first-hand report of a chilling encounter deep in the Pennsylvania wilderness. I'm still shaking as I type this. I've gone over it 100 times in my head, and I can't make sense of it. My name is Derek, though some friends call me Deke, and I just got back from what was supposed to be a peaceful weekend in the Allegheny National Forest in northwestern Pennsylvania. I'd planned on a simple 2-night camping trip. The biggest threats I'd considered were black bears, maybe a rabid raccoon if I was really unlucky. But that was before I realized something else was out there, stalking me in the dark. I headed in via the Marianville side, off Route 66. I'd pitched my tent at a somewhat secluded spot near the Minister Creek area. Some of you might know it's known for nice rock formations and old-growth hemlocks. It was chilly, but not too bad during the day, maybe in the low 40s, but the nights dropped to near freezing. Nothing unusual at first. I did notice an odd silence around dusk, like the forest just went dead quiet. But I shrugged it off, thinking maybe the cold weather had already driven most of the wildlife into deeper cover. I swear the only reason I decided to share this with the YouTube channel crowd is because of how indescribably terrifying it got on the second night. The first night, I heard some weird rustling around 2 a.m. That's not unusual. Squirrels, raccoons, deer, all sorts of critters are active at night. But something about this rustling was heavier, more deliberate. Sounded like it was pacing around the perimeter of my sight. I kept my flashlight within reach and tried to sleep, but it was impossible. At dawn, I poked around and found footprints in the mud about 50 feet from my tent. They were large and oddly shaped, almost like a dog's paw print, but elongated. Not to mention, they sank deeper into the ground than a normal animal track would. I snapped a couple of photos on my phone, no idea if they turned out clearly, but I'm pretty sure they were bigger than my hand spread out. I told myself it could be a big coyote, or maybe a stray dog with some unusual gait, but I was rattled. The last time I saw prints that big was, well, never. I tried to calm down, spent the day hiking a loop trail near the creek. Around 3 p.m., I ran into another hiker, older guy wearing a battered camo jacket, who said he'd seen something weird out in the trees. He didn't go into detail, just mumbled something about they come out when it's cold, and left me standing there scratching my head. By then, the overcast skies were rolling in, and I knew I had to start heading back before dark. I didn't see anyone else on the trail. That second night, this is when everything went sideways. It was probably close to midnight. My campfire had burned down to embers, and I was lying in my sleeping bag trying to drift off. That's when I heard a low growl, like it was right outside my tent wall. It was so close I could practically feel the vibration in my chest. Before I even had a chance to react, I heard heavy footsteps circling around again, only this time they sounded like they were on 2 legs, not 4. I sat there, paralyzed, wondering if maybe a person was messing with me. But then I heard that growl again, deeper, unnatural, not like anything a normal human throat could produce. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent a couple of inches, and tried to look out. I caught the reflection of 2 eyes in the dark. They were high off the ground, almost at the level of my shoulders when I stand up, and they glowed this odd yellowish green. I must have gasped or made some noise because it darted back behind a tree. I stepped out of the tent fully, and that's when I saw it. A silhouette, taller than me. I'm 6'1", with a canine-like head and long arms. It let out a snarl that sounded like a mix of a dog's bark and a human scream. I don't know how else to describe it. Panic took over. I grabbed the bear spray I keep in my pack and started yelling anything I could think of, hoping to scare it off. It didn't run away, though. It just kept pacing, circling around the faint glow of my dying campfire. The scariest moment was when it lunged closer and I could see the outline of its body, muscular but lean, with a weird hunched posture. My flashlight flickered, and I swear it looked like it was grinning. That's the image I can't get out of my head. I bolted, left half my gear behind, just took my keys, phone, and the bear spray. I tore down the trail, practically blind. You know how in the forest at night, especially in late fall, everything is a tangle of branches and shadows. I tripped every few yards. I could hear this thing chasing me. Its footsteps were heavy, and occasionally I'd hear that growl again, or a snarl that made every hair on my neck stand on end. I have no idea how long I ran. The next thing I remember is stumbling onto Forest Road 131, the gravel road that leads back toward the main highway, and nearly collapsing. A pickup truck eventually came by, an older woman driving who looked as shocked as I was. She helped me into her cab and asked what the heck happened to me. I must have looked insane, covered in dirt and pine needles, panting like a hunted animal. She kept asking if I was hurt, or if someone attacked me, but all I could say was that there was something out there. She offered to drive me straight to the state police barracks near Marianville. I was in such a daze I just nodded. The police took my statement, but I'm sure they thought I was either delirious or lying. They asked if I was under the influence of anything, or if maybe I'd seen a bear or a large wolf. I tried to explain the two-legged posture, the snarling that sounded almost human, but they just gave me that blank, polite stare. One trooper suggested maybe I'd had a run-in with a rabid coyote or a black bear with a deformity, but I could tell none of them truly believed me. They took a report, though, and told me if I wanted to go back for my gear, they'd send an officer with me in the morning. When morning came, we drove out, me and a young officer who seemed more curious than dismissive. We found my campsite torn up, my tent shredded, my cooler knocked over, and fresh prints in the mud. The officer crouched down, measured one of the prints with a tape measure. He looked pale. He said he wasn't sure what could have done that. He took a few photos with his phone. Then he told me he needed to call the station. More officers arrived, including some sort of wildlife specialist. They taped off the area, and I wasn't allowed to stick around. They didn't let me collect anything except my phone charger and a few personal items that were scattered. Everything else was now part of an ongoing investigation, they said. I found out later from a local who runs a small diner just north of Marianville that there have been sightings like this going back decades. Hunters whisper about a dogman roaming these woods. Some call it a cryptid, others call it a shapeshifter. He told me he'd seen plaster casts of footprints that look eerily similar to the ones I found, and that I'm lucky I made it out in one piece. He claimed that a buddy of his spotted something like it years ago near Kinzua Dam, but folks just chalked it up to tall tales. Police can't explain it, or won't. Locals have their theories. Most seem reluctant to talk openly unless they trust you. I've been having nightmares every night since it happened, replaying the moment those glowing eyes locked with mine. I still can't shake the feeling that if that pickup truck hadn't come along when it did, I might have ended up a statistic. Whatever that thing was, it's still out there, prowling the forests of Pennsylvania. And the worst part is, I doubt this is the last time it'll make its presence known. So there you have it, another nocturnal encounter in the thick of the Alleghenies, a monstrous figure that defies zoological explanation, a frantic escape into the darkness, and a set of footprints that even local law enforcement can't quite place. The question remains, was it a glimpse into a hidden realm of folklore and cryptids, or simply the fevered imagination of a rattled camper lost in the night? Another strange encounter fades away. A trick of the mind, or something far more unsettling. That's for you to decide. Thank you so much for watching my stories. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support is what keeps this channel going.